This is the Retro XP Podcast, a podcast dedicated to retro video games from the first and second gen, with the Odyssey and the Atari 2600 all the way up to Gen 7 with the Xbox 360 and the PS3. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the origins and the roots of survival horror as a genre. Sorry, that's lame. I'm sorry. I'll not do that again. We'll go back all the way to the Commodore 64 and move into what is called the Golden Age of survival horror in the late 90s and early 2000s. We'll obviously be talking about the big ones like Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark, and Silent Hill, and some lesser known ones like Fatal Frame, Deep Fear, Galerians, and more. All right, so let's enter the world of survival horror. Retro XP is part of the Hair of the Dogcast network, so be sure to check out patreon.com/Hair of the Dogcast to check out every show the network has and get access to the exclusive community Discord. There is a 30-day free trial available if you want to try it out. Otherwise, you can follow me on X, Threads, Instagram, and YouTube at RetroXPodcast. Whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on, be sure to follow and enable notifications so you can find out when I drop a new episode. So when we think of survival horror, we obviously think of Resident Evil. I mean, I believe they pretty much coined that term, using it as a tagline for their first title for the PS1 back in 1996. I remember when you walked into the mansion itself, right at the beginning of the game, the tagline, "Enter the world of survival horror." So whether they knew they were going to be building a genre or not at the time, I don't know. But, here we are talking about it. However, even before then, the genre itself goes a bit further back. And currently, right now, in 2026, we're experiencing a renaissance of the genre since the success of the Resident Evil 2 remake back in 2018, and even Resident Evil 7 a little bit, which came out, I believe, the year before. It even spawned some retro-styled modern games to hit our screens now. And there's some examples that I've played recently, games like Hollow Body, Crow Country, Dead of Darkness, Heartworm, Fear the Spotlight. Plenty of others actually are still slated to come out. My wish list is pretty full with a lot of these, so I'm really excited for them to come out. But with every story, there's a beginning, so let's start with the definition of survival horror as a genre. And generally, when we classify games as survival horror, there are a few boxes we need to check. Survival horror isn't just a blanket term for, just a genre like horror, for example. So there's a little bit different. Obviously, the setting needs to be horror fiction based, which, as we know, can be a broad genre in and of itself. So generally, your enemies are monsters. However, their designs can vary, and of course, so can their origins. I mean, we've seen a lot of ones with, they could be zombies, they could be science-created monsters in like a laboratory, they could be aliens, they could be just possessed animals, they could be ghosts, demons, possessed humans even. And generally, they're not as in-your-face and aggressive as one would see in a more action-focused game. They stalk, they prey, they hide, and they jump out at you and your character mostly. Some of these enemies can provide tells, either through sound or even visual cues. Their presence is meant to deliver this sense of dread and anxiety, almost like you just want to play the game and not encounter them at all. It's almost like they're almost so overpowered that they feel like it's a boss battle every time you encounter one of these enemies. And you never know when they're going to pop out at you in a lot of these cases. A few of these cases, too, as well, a few of these types of enemies, they can be invulnerable. Stalker-type enemies that will pursue you throughout the entirety of the game. Hell, some games even pit the environment against you. Weather, decrepit buildings, fire, etc., or, even worse, puzzles. Now, take it or leave it. Some people like puzzles. I like puzzles in my games. Other people don't because they can kind of break the environment or whatever. But puzzles in the environment can kind of block access to certain areas. They can reveal special items or even unlock parts of your own character's psyche that can present quite the challenge for the player, especially with some of the more obscure ones. I would say, so long as you have a brain in your skull, for the most part, you can figure these out yourself. But Granted, in the early days, you couldn't just Google the answer. Nowadays, you can just easily Google the answer if you want to just kind of breeze right through it. Some of these puzzles may need to be solved using items you find in the environment, deciphering a clue, like reading like a poem or something like that, that's requires you to kind of decipher it and figure out how to solve the puzzle, or even just dumbass trial and error, actually. I think I remember in Resident Evil 1, I can never remember the combination to the pharmaceutical room door right before the Plant 42 room, so I'm just hitting buttons until it just figures itself out. I played that game so many times and I still don't know it. In some of the golden age of survival horror games, they used fixed camera angles that did a lot of work kind of hiding enemies from your view, or even hiding certain elements in the environment. You would control your character in the environment. Usually these are in tight claustrophobic areas with a lot of obstacles in your path, a lot of environment in your way, or just dark shadows obscuring your environment. You can't see everything. And the enemies would oftentimes be lurking off screen. Sometimes you hear them, but can't see them or predict where they will come out at you. So a lot of these moments, you're just like, I hear the enemies, I just can't see them, and I don't know where they are. Then next scene, they're right in front of you. The tools that you're given to fight these enemies are very scarce in a lot of ways. And the player is oftentimes encouraged to run or evade these enemies more so than fight them. And granted, there are times when combat is unavoidable. In other cases, it may be smart to either just wound them and move on, or just attempt to dodge them. You get weapons, sure, like melee weapons, bats, crowbars or whatever. Guns, like handguns, shotguns or whatever. And even some odd weapons, like say, an old camera, in the case of Fatal Frame, but which we'll talk more about that later. But also, on top of this, you get very limited ammo. You don't get infinite ammo. You don't pick up ammo. It's not very plentiful in the environment. You're getting, like small amounts of bullets. As far as melee weapons go, in some games, they can actually break on you if you use them too much. Or maybe some games you don't even have a weapon at all. Maybe hiding is your best bet to try to avoid these enemies. Or even just using the environment as your offense. And your hero isn't an all-powerful protagonist either. In most cases, they're not painted as a super soldier, combat veteran, or even a suited up specialist with big armor and protective gear and equipment. Most, if not all of these games, you're just an average person trying to survive the worst day of your life. No armor, no shields, no overpowered weapons, nothing. Some survival games have the protagonist be kind of like young women with severe anxiety, or kind of frail, not strong. Some have males with psychological trauma that are kind of become their own worst enemy in some cases, or just completely untrained people thrust into a situation that are woefully unprepared for. You don't have a lot of health, and you can't recover without the utilization of health items, which even then, health items is not very plentiful in the environment. To add to this already weakened state, you can only carry a certain amount of items at one given time. You may encounter an item in the universe that you need or maybe want, but you can't pick it up or you can't carry it because, your inventory is full. So, the odds are very much against you in a lot of these games. And for many people, survival horror is just a very niche genre. And it's not a genre a lot of people enjoy. I'll admit that there's not a lot of joy in playing a game against overwhelming odds with very little to utilize as any sort of offense. It's very anxiety ridden. It's like almost dreading. It's like, man, I have to go through this level. I have 2 bullets in my handgun, and I know there's going to be enemies on this route. I'm not looking forward to going through that. You really can't play aggressively. You have to play cautiously. You have to play carefully. And oftentimes, playing slow is actually playing fast. Most people that like to play games, even back then and more so now, are more interested in playing games as like the overpowered superhero that just mows down enemies like they aren't even there. And all these end with happy endings. And most survival horror games, they don't end well. I would say most, not all. Just like horror movies sometimes. But origins of the genre itself, survival horror, maybe I would say started with H.P. Lovecraft, who was, I'm pretty sure you've heard the name before, but he was a famous author from the early 1900s, and he's had kind of a very tragic life, and you can kind of tell that a little bit in a lot of the stories and novels that he wrote. but most of his themes revolved around psychological horror and insignificant and weak protagonists fighting against all odds against overpowered antagonists, or even just the cosmos itself. H.P. Lovecraft had this kind of prevailing thought that humans are just weak and minor in the grand scheme of the cosmos. We're insignificant little beings. We're almost like little viruses, and it's like, there's bigger things at work that are much more powerful and much more important than we are as humans. So he's very belittling to humans, I guess, in a lot of his stories. So books like Call of Cthulhu, pretty sure you've heard of that one, The Shadow over Innsmouth, At the Mountains of Madness, and so on. So that's some of his most popular stuff. Actually, his work directly inspires many still in its own genre. Lovecraftian horror, that's what they call it. You see this in a lot of books and movies, and especially video games. Some games I'll talk about will be directly inspired by his work. Now, I obviously live in America, so typically here in the Western audiences consumed horror that was physical and visceral in nature. Blood, gore, big monsters. We grew up watching Jason, Freddy, Michael Myers, all these monsters that killed, basically. Not to mention demons like, Pinhead or whatever, and then zombies, to name a few. The Nightmare, Night of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead series, all that stuff. The Japanese preferred more psychological horror and even, a little bit of ghost stories too, mixed in. So for Japanese developers, it was hard to break into Western markets with their own brand of horror. So when they found survival horror coming kind of more popular, they think they kind of started rolling with it. And according to some searching I did, what was defined as maybe the first true survival horror game was Shiryu Sensen, War of the Dead. And this is an interesting mix. It's a mix of old school Dragon Quest and Zelda 2, which is interesting calling this a survival horror game, but it very much is. I watched extended gameplay of this, which has me kind of interested. You're tasked as a SWAT team member charged with saving a small town from a monster infestation. You have to rescue survivors and take them to a local church once you kind of rescue them. Combat popped up randomly like they did in Zelda 2 in the areas where you're on the overworlds, and then all of a sudden you would just kind of warp into a battle, and it's side-scrolling battle similar to Zelda 2, and you have to shoot the monsters that kind of pop up. Once you clear the screen, you move on. This came out for the MSX and the PC Engine at the time in Japan. However, in 1989, we saw two big survival horror games hit the market. I don't want to say big, groundbreaking, but they kind of opened up the conversation a bit. Sweet Home, which many arguably would say was the direct inspiration for Resident Evil, and Project Firestart, which was a science fiction survival horror game. And I would say almost kind of an inspiration for Dead Space, which we saw later on in the 360 and PS3's life cycle. So Sweet Home was created by Tokuro Fujiwara, who would later go on to create Resident Evil. Sweet Home's gameplay focused on solving a variety of puzzles using items stored in a limited inventory, a theme that we're going to see constantly in a lot of these survival horror games, while battling or escaping from horrifying creatures which could lead to permanent death for any of the characters, thus creating tension and emphasis on survival. I do have to say I'm not a fan of permadeath in games. It just seems like it's unforgiving. I'm not knocking it as a game mechanic. If you like that, that anxiety in the pit of your stomach for if this character dies, I could lose them forever. Good on you. But for me, it's maybe it just drives my anxiety a little bit higher on that when I play those games. But that's why I don't play the Fire Emblem games. It was also the first attempt at creating a scary and frightening storyline within a game at this time. Like I said, this came out for the Famicom, for the Nintendo pretty much, mainly told through scattered diary entries left behind 50 years before the events of this game. And this game was actually developed by Capcom and, like I said, became the main inspiration behind Resident Evil. Its horrific imagery prevented its release in the West, especially since Nintendo was just trying to paint itself as a family-oriented system. Nonetheless, its influence was felt throughout Resident Evil. And throughout the original development of Resident Evil, this was supposed to be a kind of a remake or a retelling of Sweet Home. That was the initial idea. And then all of a sudden, once they started making it, they were like, maybe we should make something kind of different. So Sweet Home itself was a role-playing game set within a mansion that had this kind of like cohesive, intricate layout like we see in Resident Evil. 5 playable characters who could venture solo or explore in teams of 2 or 3, and you could switch between characters and parties at any time, and each character has a unique item that is necessary to complete the game. One has a camera, one has a lighter, another has a medical kit, lockpick, and a vacuum cleaner. It's a weird item. Along with these items are others that can be picked up and dropped anywhere and retrieved later by other characters. And the game kind of places an emphasis on puzzle solving, inventory management, and obviously survival. So you got to backtrack a lot in order to solve puzzles using items acquired later in the game. And this interconnected mansion is gradually explored in the style of Metroidvania games. You unlock parts of the mansion little by little the further along you go. And enemies in this game, just like any RPG at this time, are encountered randomly, and you can either fight them or run away through like kind of menu-based combat, like what you knew of as turn-based battles back then. And they're presented in a first-person perspective. And, you're fighting zombies, you're fighting ghosts, you're fighting dolls. And, if you, take any damage, you can restore your health through tonics. Like I said, limited amount, not going to find a lot. And actually, this story is told through cinematic cutscenes and notes that you find throughout the mansion, like diary entries, secret messages from past visitors that visited this mansion. And a lot of these notes can provide clues not only to the story, but also how to solve the puzzles. And there's also quick time events in this game. So, like I said, there's permadeath in this game. So that could affect your ending. And I hear actually there's 5 endings to this game. So this was at the same time, there was another game that came out, Project Firestart, and a little bit more unique in terms of horror, what we knew it as. And this was a science fiction horror. And this kind of was kind of inspired by the film Alien, and had gameplay closely resembling later survival horror games in many ways. This was a very new and unique type of survival horror game at this time. This came out in 1989, same year Sweet Home did, for the Commodore 64, and it was pegged to have achieved the kind of fully formed vision of survival horror as we know it today. And it has this, it's described as having this like fine balance of horror, action, adventure, limited ammunition, weak guns, weak weapons, this vulnerable main character that's not, powerful at all, and feelings of isolation in space, storytelling through journals and, computer entries, graphic violence at the time for whatever you thought graphic violence was. Watching some of the videos, actually, it's like the opening part is when your character boards this spaceship, like he finds like corpses everywhere. And it's like, that was probably brutal to see at the time. And there's dynamically triggered music. So you're wandering through the levels, sometimes with kind of muted music or no music. And then all of a sudden, once you encounter enemies, bam, that's when the music hits. As you may have already guessed, these are some of the most prime tenets of survival horror games, even to this day. It's like, well, yeah, this is kind of par for the course for survival horror. This game, like I said, is a side-scrolling, pseudo kind of 3D action adventure game. And they call it cabinet projection, which is... I didn't know was a gameplay mechanic until all of a sudden I was researching this. Basically, this gives the action greater depth. You're basically like Streets of Rage. You move up and down in what's kind of like a pseudo 3D space, so to speak. You're basically moving in and out of the background. The HUD and on-screen information is very limited. It just shows the health of your main character and the amount of ammo you have available. Some of the terminals through the space contain logs, journal entries of the personnel, which provide a history of the genetic project and thus the backstory, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. It was so lore heavy and something that we know now as just like commonplace. Occasionally, due to a player action or at fixed points of the game would pause for a cutscene, actually, featuring either the hero or the monsters. So the storyline takes place in 2061, so I would say in about like 40 years. Agent John Hawking of the United System States is sent to research the ship Prometheus in orbit around Titan. I think that's one of Saturn's moons. His mission is to make contact with members of Project Firestart, which was an initiative of the System Science Foundation, who have recently dropped out of communication with their superiors on Earth. So, send one guy in to find out what's going on. Genius. He's further instructed to retrieve all the data on board the Prometheus and then destroy the ship, based on the belief that the project has been compromised that could potentially pose a threat to Earth. And should he fail in this mission, the USS will remotely activate the Prometheus self-destruct sequence on the assumption that Hawking himself has been killed. And apparently there are 6 endings to this game as well. It's kind of cool. We got multiple endings on like just limited hardware, limited games. So if Sweet Home and Project Firestart got the conversation started, Alone in the Dark got the whole room talking and got it buzzing. Alone in the Dark came out in 1992, just a couple years after all this stuff, for the PC. And you can actually buy it now on Good Old Games on PC. I think they actually had a special recently with the very first 3 Alone in the Dark games were almost free for a very limited time, so I slapped that in my cart. Players choose between a male or female protagonist, Edward Carnby or Emily Hartwood, respectively, and are trapped inside the haunted mansion of Derceto. The player, and I think this takes place in kind of like the Deep South, like New Orleans, Louisiana area. The player character finds documents throughout the house indicating that Derceto, the place that you're in, was built by an occultist pirate named Ezekiel Pregst. I think that's how you say it. And that beneath the house are caverns wherein he performed dark rituals to enlarge his fortune and unnaturally extend his life. He was shot, ultimately, and Derceto was burned down by an encamped Union soldiers during the American Civil War. However, his spirit lived on, coming to inhabit an old tree in the caverns underneath Derceto. The player character starts in the attic, having ascended to the top of the mansion without incident in the beginning, and becomes tasked with finding a way out of the mansion while avoiding, outsmarting, or defeating various supernatural enemies. Although able to kill most enemies with your fists and your feet, so you can punch and you can kick, players can, you can also utilize other weapons like guns and melee weapons and stuff throughout the environment. Other opponents can only be beaten by solving particular puzzles rather than a straight fight, like some of the bigger enemies. And still, sometimes, you got those stalker enemies that can't be killed, and you just kind of got to avoid them. Much of the game involves exploration, puzzle solving, and you can search through the house for clues as to what occurred before the player's arrival. You don't really have to, but I think it just lends itself to exploring and finding out more about the lore. So, you could pull objects, you could pick up items, yada, yada. Obviously, as we know in survival horror games, your inventory is limited, and sometimes you got to discard items to, make room for other ones. But you can't just discard any item. You have to make sure that what you have is what you need. But you can actually just dump the items onto the floor, and then you can pick them up later, so long as you know kind of where you put them. So inventory space is interesting. It's not like you have a limited amount of stuff that you could take. It's determined by weight. So you can discard several lightweight items, but not able to pick up a heavier weighted item. It's kind of interesting. And here, Alone in the Dark has like this non-linear level design, which is something unique at the time. Your character is initially restricted to the attic and the 3rd floor, and the rooms are arranged in such a way that they have to be transversed into a kind of like a linear order. But of course, you're going back and forth and doing a lot of backtracking. Complete the puzzles, get further down upon completing these specific puzzles. And, moving all the way down, you get to the caverns beneath the mansion, which is kind of where the end of the game is. So once you get there, it's completely linear. And of course, you got more puzzles as well in this area. This game, I would argue, and I don't think anybody would, is pretty much the first official 3D survival horror game. Now, later on, interestingly enough, even though this was a 3D survival horror game, we still had 2D games coming out. And Clock Tower was one that came out in 1995 for the Super Famicom. And this came out exclusively in Japan, never here in the West. It's a point-and-click adventure with 2D graphics. And the player controls a cursor to direct the main character. If you don't know what point-and-click adventure games are, I don't know how to help you, but I highly suggest playing point. I don't know. It was big back in that day, but it was kind of like a unique gameplay mechanic. You're controlling the main character, Jennifer Simpson, and you give commands to her, such as, go investigate this, go open that door, go walk to this area, go run to this area. Of course, if you run, you have stamina, so you don't want to reduce that stamina too much. She can recover her stamina by sitting on the floor, interestingly enough. Your character's portrait in the corner of the screen will change depending on her stamina level. So if you have low stamina, she'll look more distressed. In addition to interacting with objects in the game, you can also store them in the inventory for later use. The layout of the items change with each playthrough. And the shtick of this game is that your character, Jennifer, is under the constant threat of a stalker named Scissorman. And you can obviously imagine what kind of weapon he's using. He's using a very oversized scissors. When you confront Scissorman, the game will enter in this panic mode. And depending on your health status, if your health is low, she may begin to trip, slow down, and then the Scissorman will just catch up to you easily. She cannot use weapons against Scissorman. Instead, you have to find hiding spots throughout the mansion or use traps placed in the environment. If you're caught, obviously, you can try to escape. You have to rapidly press a button. If you die, though, then it is game over. That's it. Interesting. I would also argue, too, with Clock Tower that this would be the first game where we got kind of like a stalker enemy and a weaponless protagonist. And we got to see more Clock Tower games, and unfortunately, the last one was way back in Clock Tower 3 for the PlayStation 2. I think that was 2002, which is kind of a shame. Such a good trilogy. We did get a remake actually recently called Clock Tower Rewind. It's all modern platforms right now. I have the physical copy. I should probably bust that out soon. I bought it just, I would say, a year ago through limited run. Anyway, the game features 9 possible endings, which is kind of cool. So, with the early successes of these games, the Golden Age didn't really hit until 1996, and you can imagine what game hit in 1996 that ushered in this Golden Age, and that was Resident Evil for the PlayStation. In this game, the player chooses to play as either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine as they explore the Spencer Mansion in Forest, so to speak, near the town of Raccoon City. And they're there to find missing police special forces compatriots and, of course, secure an escape route after that. It's supposed to be an easy pick up and leave kind of thing, but they get ambushed in the beginning of the game. They get ambushed by a bunch of dogs, forced into this mansion. And then now, in order for them to get out of this mansion, they have to solve a bunch of puzzles and make your way further down and, uncover this massive conspiracy with a pharmaceutical company, and now they have to fight zombies and monsters. And the environment is presented from a third-person perspective, using fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds, kind of similar to Alone in the Dark, and which was revolutionary at the time because it provided this crazy sense of realism. When I say that, I mean at the time. Did not age so well now, but at the time, this was pretty... you thought video games can't get any better than this. And it's also, these pre-rendered backgrounds and stuff added depth to the worlds. Also revolutionary, like I said, at the time, was player using tank controls to move. And this means that whatever direction your character is facing in the world, hitting the up button made you move forward. And this made sense, kind of, in the fixed camera perspective these games were in, since in some scenes your character faced a different way than in previous angles. So just holding up kind of kept you moving forward, so to speak. It didn't age well, I'll admit that, but, that's what we had at the time. Certain parts of the environment can be examined, items can be collected, you can push things around, you can navigate from room to room, doors, stairs, elevators, the infamous door opening sequence that was kind of like where loading screens were hidden. So you would approach a door, you would see a door opening animation very slowly, and it's sometimes it can be immersion breaking, but that was how they kind of hid loading screens at the time. And both characters that you had, both Chris and Jill, had different perks. which is kind of unique. Chris had more health, handles heavy weapons more effectively, while Jill has an increased inventory capacity. And you can have a lockpick that opens several locked doors, which Chris must find actual keys for. So it's kind of, with Jill, you can kind of beat the game, I would say, a little bit quicker. You can actually dump your items temporarily in item boxes. So not like in Alone in the Dark where you just dumped it on the floor. Here, you could throw it in an item box, especially a bunch of ones that you won't use till later, like for puzzles. So there's like emblems and shields and crests and keys and stuff like that you could just dump temporarily. So several of the Resident Evil Mansion's pre-rendered backdrops were actually inspired directly by the Overlook Hotel, which was the setting for the movie The Shining back in 1980. Shinji Mikami, the game's director, also cited the 1978 film Dawn of the Dead as an inspiration for this game. So the game itself was initially conceived as a fully 3D and actually a first-person game with action and shooting mechanics. First-person prototype was produced and initially featured a supernatural, psychological Japanese horror style similar to Sweet Home. Like I said, the initial development of this was supposed to be a remake of the first game, Sweet Home, before opting for an American zombie horror style influenced by George A. Romero films. Zombie movies were getting to be pretty popular during this time. So during production, Mikami discovered Alone in the Dark, which influenced him a lot to adopt a cinematic fixed camera view system. Mikami said that in an interview that if it was not for Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil would have had a first-person view instead. So crazy how one game influenced another game like pretty directly. I wonder if Resident Evil would have been as big as it was in first person like it is now. I hesitate to think that. But yeah, like I said, once they kind of like played around with the Alone in the Dark fixed view camera system, he quoted it saying it had an effect on immersion. It made the player feel a bit more detached, but it eventually adopted it because the use of the pre-rendered backdrops allowed for like this higher level of detail than his fully 3D first-person view prototype. And first-person games didn't work so well on the PlayStation. Especially the PlayStation 1, we didn't have a lot of really good examples of first-person games at this time. We got to see the fruits of their labor come to pass 2 years later when Resident Evil 2 came out, and man, did it take survival horror to a new level. This time, instead of it being located in one house, you are now in a full city. Smaller areas to explore, like the open streets, police station, sewer system, and obviously many more places. Resident Evil 2 was even more successful than its previous title, and with it being bigger and better in every way possible. I talked about it earlier in a previous episode. I labeled it as one of my top 10 games of all time, so you'll probably get an episode from me with more of a deep dive into Resident Evil 2. In 1999, though, we saw a different kind of survival horror game come out called Silent Hill. This game drew heavily from Resident Evil, although it used real-time 3D environments in contrast to Resident Evil's pre-rendered background graphics. And in this one, the player's objective is to guide the main protagonist and player character, Harry Mason, through a monster-filled town as he searches for his lost daughter, Cheryl. The gameplay consists of combat, exploration, and puzzle solving, typical for survival horror fare. But the game uses a third-person view, primarily from behind the back, with the camera occasionally swinging to other angles for a dramatic effect in pre-scripted areas, like the infamous scene walking in the beginning of the game where you're walking through the alleyway and the camera kind of panning out and then zooming in. That was such a cool scene. I remember seeing that when I was younger. I was 18 years old playing this game, and I was like, oh man, this looks so cool. I was in high school, so I was still 17 at the time. Anyway, this approach differs from other survival horror games at the time, which frequently shifted through various camera angles using those pre-rendered backgrounds. Like I said, a lot of games at this time was kind of doing the Resident Evil thing. Harry confronts monsters in each area using both melee weapons and firearms. No breakable weapons here in this game, thankfully. Being an ordinary man, Harry cannot sustain many blows from enemies, and actually, interestingly enough, if you're sprinting and running for a long time, he pauses and starts to gasp for breath, which is kind of cool. And, he's not really experienced with firearms, so it's kind of clumsy using weapons in this game. One of the tenets of Silent Hill is carrying a portable radio, and the radio can alert Harry to the presence of nearby creatures with bursts of static. Although, if you want, you can turn it off. You don't have to have it, but I think it just helps you plan for enemies coming your way. Visibility is one of the other tenets of Silent Hill. Is visibility, mostly low due to fog and darkness. And another tenet of Silent Hill is the other world, which is a kind of like nightmarish, ghoulish, dark world that takes over your entire environment. Silent Hill in particular was praised, actually, at the time for moving away from the B-movie horror elements to more of a psychological style seen in art house or Japanese horror films. So this is a very Japanese-themed horror game. And this was due to the game's emphasis on disturbing atmosphere rather than visceral horror. I mean, there were a lot of visceral horror in this, but this game was more unsettling instead of, kind of more the macabre or whatever. The game also featured stealth elements. You can actually, for the most part, you can avoid enemies. You can just kind of run away from them or even just avoid them altogether. The original Silent Hill is considered one of the scariest games of all time, and the strong narrative from Silent Hill 2 in 2001 has made the Silent Hill series one of the most influential in the genre, which I would agree wholeheartedly. And as we know, Silent Hill 2 hit our PS2s a few years after that in 2001 and just blew the doors off the genre, as well as blew our sanity. If you want to hear more about how amazing of a game Silent Hill 2 is, check out my previous episode where I talk all about it. There is a remake of Silent Hill 2 out right now, which is very good. And a remake of the first one is currently in development, so I will definitely let you know how that is when that game comes out. Fatal Frame from 2001 was a pretty unique entry into the genre, as the player explores a mansion and takes photographs of ghosts in order to defeat them. The Fatal Frame series has gained a reputation as one of the most distinctive in the genre. It's a very unique gameplay, and we got 3 of them for the PlayStation 2, and we've had a few scattered ones come out on the Wii, on the Switch, and then we just got the remake of Fatal Frame 2 that just came out last week, actually. The story is set in the year 1986, and it focuses on orphan siblings Miku and Mafuyu Hinasaki, who share this ability to sense and perceive supernatural elements. Don't know how, but they do. Mafuyu disappears into this haunted Himuro mansion that they're exploring, and he's searching for his tutor, Junsei Takamine, and his assistants. Miku follows his brother to the Himuro mansion, and she explores the mansion and discovers signs that Takamine's party were killed by the mansion's ghosts, and finds rope burns appearing on her wrists and ankles, unfortunately, which are these rope burns that kill the people in this mansion are manifestations of a curse on anyone who enters Himuro Mansion. Further exploration through the mansion turns up information on this dark ritual that took place within the mansion, and the rope shrine maiden was, torn apart. It's a weird ritual. And apparently the ritual is that the, ropes were supposed to tear apart and seal the hellgate that is underneath the mansion itself. And yeah, so your weapon in this is a camera. The camera obscura. Ghosts in the environments are sensed using a character's kind of sixth sense, and you'll hear kind of like a whine or a drone, and then all of a sudden this ghost will just materialize in front of you. And if the ghosts come in contact with you, they drain your health. So when you use the camera, the view switches to a first-person view, and if you hold focus onto a ghost, it can enable greater damage. But the ghosts fade in and out of view as they approach, so you gotta be quick about it sometimes. The most damage is dealt when the ghost is very close. The camera will kind of blink red. That'll be kind of like your super shot, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a unique gameplay mechanic and one that's kind of prevailed throughout all the other Fatal Frame games. I would say the camera obscura is pretty much the tenet of the series, with, and other characters from like each game has different characters, and they all surround, old Shinto rituals and, kind of ghost stories or whatever. So it's not like all the stories are connected. It's just kind of similar in theme of the camera obscura, so to speak. And it was during this time that survival horror games hit this kind of point when they were just labeled as Resident Evil clones, which was unfortunate actually, because by themselves, many of them were great games. One of my favorite ones at the time was Deep Fear, which came out in 1996 for the Sega Saturn. Unfortunately, in Japan and Europe only. But I got to play this recently. I ended up picking this up recently, and I was like, man, this was definitely a missed opportunity. It was a survival horror game that took place in this underwater facility infected by monsters. So campy. It's so campy. It's so good. And I think a lot of these, I mentioned it earlier that a lot of survival horror games were kind of B movie rated with like campy dialogue or campy characters. And, it's a weird kind of complement of just like serious horror elements with like campy characters or like, kind of unintentional humor, so to speak. But it worked. I don't know how it worked, but it did. Deep Fear, like I said, was a little bit more action oriented. Similarly, Chaos Break came out for the PlayStation around the same time. And this one was more of a brawler, if anything. But it still was a good game. This is another game I kind of picked up. I picked up a Japanese copy, so I can play Japanese and European copies of games on my Polymega. So it's definitely nice that I can pick these up and play them. Dino Crisis came out in 1999 for the PlayStation and was also a survival horror game, similar to Resident Evil, but there's a very distinct reason why. This game was produced and directed by Shinji Mikami, who was the original Resident Evil's director, and that's probably why it's so similar. In this game, you're actually fighting against dinosaurs set loose from an experiment gone wrong. We saw Dino Crisis 2 come out in this same generation, and we did have a Dino Crisis 3 come out on the Xbox, but a little bit different than the first two games. Galerians, which came out in 1999, is an interesting one that I actually played on the PlayStation a lot. In this game, you're a boy trying to save his sister in a large, sprawling scientific laboratory, and your weapons are your own unlocked, untapped psychic powers. And you can utilize various type of psychic abilities, like you can set your enemies on fire, as one kind of common psychic ability you have. And then you can even like, I don't want to say you force yourself a headache, but you get to a point where you use so much psychic abilities that you start to lose control, and characters that are kind of walking by you become just their heads explode. It's kind of cool, actually. But of course, it robs you of your health, so it's not like you can just walk around just blowing heads up. There's a lot more exploration in this game compared to other survival horror games at this time. Another unique one is Parasite Eve. This came out 1998 for the PlayStation as well. And if you're sensing a trend here on where all the survival horror games are coming out, there's a reason. A lot of this genre became popular with the PlayStation because it was arguably, I would say, the most powerful system at the time that could kind of do this stuff besides the PC, but more people were playing on the PlayStation than on a PC. And this game came out from Squaresoft at the time, or what we know now as Square Enix. And it's actually a sequel to a novel of the same name. The story follows New York City police officer Aya Brea over a 6-day span in 1997 as she attempts to stop the Eve, a woman who plans to destroy the human race through spontaneous human combustion. Very interesting mechanic. Players explore levels set in the areas of New York City while utilizing a pausable real-time combat system along with several role-playing elements. So it was almost like turn-based strategy, turn-based combat in a 3D action adventure space. It's very unique at the time. It's not one that I think a lot of people have emulated. We did see a sequel to this one come out a year or two later after that. I gotta talk about some duds here, of course, because there were some good ones and there were some that tried and just didn't do so well. Countdown Vampires was one. You were a kind of disgraced cop and you were supposed to be the bouncer for this nightclub, and of course, the nightclub is full of vampires. So something happens in this nightclub, and you're tasked with saving all the innocent people within a given amount of time. It wasn't good. It wasn't good. I tried multiple times to play this. I was like, I just can't get into this. Martian Gothic Unification. This was an interesting one. And this game is kind of more focused on puzzle solving and exploration rather than combat. I would say it's almost like 70-30. The game is centered on 3 playable characters that are separated, and you can swap between them at any time. Kind of similar to Day of the Tentacle, if you ever played that game. And what was the other one? Maniac Mansion. Game, your characters can communicate over radio, like especially if one of your characters finds clues to solve something, you can actually communicate it to another person. And the interesting shtick about this is if you ever meet face to face, it will result in a game over. And that's because, spoiler alert, they're infected themselves. So if they encounter each other, then they turn into monsters or whatever. So I don't know. It was a slow game, not very interesting. It was a unique mechanic, but not enough to keep me interested, I guess. Oh yeah, there was The Ring, Terror's Realm. I discovered this game only a couple years ago when I saw it. It's for the Dreamcast, and this came out in 2000. And I was like, this is a game? I never knew this was a game. Your character, Meg, your boyfriend, Robert, is among 4 workers at the CDC who have died mysteriously on the same day. And the only thing that connects them is a computer program found in their computers called Ring. While you're there, the CDC is put under lockdown, and you find yourself imprisoned in the center with her other coworkers. And inside the CDC, you have to find out the truth behind your boyfriend's death and what the Ring is, which it deals with a little bit of backtracking and then going into the program itself. It's a very weird, unique game. And this is another one where the acting is so bad, it's good, honestly. So, I mean, besides these, we had some other really well-known ones again, like Eternal Darkness for the GameCube. You had, I'm pretty sure some of you tuned in here wanted me to talk about this. Very heavily inspired by Lovecraftian horror, almost to a T. The game follows the story of several characters across a period of 2 millennia and 4 different locations on Earth, like almost like a Roman gladiator, kind of an archaeologist, and like an Amazonian woman, I think, or something, to name a couple, as they contend with this ancient evil who seeks to enslave humanity. The gameplay distinguishes itself with these unique sanity effects, and these were like visual and audio effects that could confuse the player and often break the fourth wall. And some of these were glitches in the gameplay. One of them was like a false error screen, which I remember for a lot of us that played the first time scared the hell out of us. And so many others. So it was cool to experience these, especially if you never expected it. And at the time, I never did. I was just thought I was playing another survival horror game. This one was unique because it, like I said, the sanity meter on top of everything that you were experiencing was, alongside of your health meter. And the more you exposed yourself to the horrors in this game, on top of the damage received, the more of these fourth wall breaks you actually started to encounter. The Thing was another good one at this time, despite, you were combat troops in an Antarctic base in a winter storm. This has a remake you can actually get right now. Still waiting on that Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem remake. Curse, The Eye of Isis was actually a very good attempt for Xbox to bring a unique survival horror game to this, to the space. The Suffering was good. It wasn't much of a survival horror game per se in terms of gameplay, but it had a lot of those like survival horror elements into it. Cold Fear was a good one. Haunting Ground was really good. Kind of similar to Clock Tower, where you were being chased by a, kind of like whatever the monster is in the area, and your main weapon, so to speak, is a dog, Huey. Rule of Rose, Obscure, Siren, Kuan. I mean, there's so many others, especially once we kind of get to the early days of the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. But I would say if you want to experience survival horror in its with the most selection, PlayStation 1 and 2 is where you should pretty much go. With the drop of Resident Evil 4 into the universe in 2005, we actually started to see less and less of an appeal of weaker enemies and underpowered protagonists from players. They didn't want to play those kind of types of characters anymore. And, became more favored of the action-oriented gameplay we would see for pretty much almost 2 decades. The bevy of clones we got leading up to this got a few people fatigued as well. While you had a handful of good examples, and you also had a bigger handful of bad examples, with some being dead on arrival and more obscure ones with limited releases. Resident Evil would actually see a future change for the foreseeable future because survival horror wasn't much interesting for a lot of players these days, so Resident Evil had to pivot while also staying relevant. So we started to see more action-oriented titles like Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, Operation Raccoon City, and so on. But nonetheless, like I said, we're starting to see and experience a renaissance currently, and with a lot of new experiences. Resident Evil 9 Requiem is kind of taking the world by storm now, if you haven't noticed, and a lot of retro infused experiences coming out as well, which I've named a few. Yeah, I hope this gave you some insight, not only in terms of what got survival horror on the map, but also talking about what are some of the games worth getting if you want to collect them. I will say, though, buyer beware, as some of these games were niche on their own, even at the times they were released. So buying them now may be quite the expensive endeavor. So, for example, I would say in my collection, going through a lot of what I have in my collection, Haunting Ground is like my most expensive survival horror game that I have. Currently complete in box, that's going for $500, and that's what the open market's going for. Take it or leave it. Silent Hill 3 is actually pretty up there too. That's about $300 complete in box. Right below it is pretty much Silent Hill 1. That goes for about $280. A lot of the Silent Hills actually are going to cost you a couple $100. It's crazy. I mean, I talked about this, I believe, earlier that I think in a previous episode where, if remakes and remasters start coming out and more people are interested in the genre's roots, that's when the prices start to go up, because, you got these third party sellers that are like, let's take advantage of this and start overpricing this stuff because the demand is getting up there. So Resident Evil 1, the long box version, I got for like 100. Well, I mean, it was my original copy, so at the time I bought it for cheaper, but this was going for like $175. Yeah, like a lot of the Resident Evil games are up there as well. I would say, yeah, around the $100 mark for the Outbreak games. Those were kind of like multiplayer games, but you can get Resident Evil 2 for the PlayStation for about $60, $70, because I think there were more copies of that sold. And they had a Resident Evil game for the PlayStation that was the Greatest Hits collection, and it had a lot of like quality of life updates. You can buy that for cheaper. I think that goes for about like $50, $60. I don't have that title, but I talked about Countdown Vampires. That's going for $120. Wow, that's wild. The Fatal Frame games, Fatal Frame 1 and 2, those are both going for about $120. Dino Crisis 2 goes for $120. Eternal Darkness is going for $100. Parasite Eve, $105 as well. Clock Tower 3 for the PlayStation 2, about $100. So Galerians itself, about $90. So it's, yeah, you're going to be spending, for survival horror games itself, you're going to be spending some money. And it's unfortunate because it's a very niche genre, but also a very well-beloved genre. And it's one I grew up playing. I played a lot of the horror games, the true horror games like Splatterhouse, a lot of Alien games, stuff like that, where you're just like this overpowered beast and you're fighting against hordes of monsters and hordes of enemies. Those are always fun, but the vulnerability and the weakened state that you're in playing survival horror games, they were more thinking games. They were more planning games and just hedging your bets. Do you want to take the risk of challenging these enemies, or do you want to just like, let me try to kind of save some ammunition here or save some health items and try to avoid them, or try to approach this cautiously instead of running in guns blazing or, something like that. So there's an appeal to these games. And granted, like I said in the beginning of this episode, they're not for everybody. They really aren't. And I get that. I understand that. But, with these niche genres, but the popularity of them and the high rating of them, that's why you're getting these third-party sellers that are pricing them as high as they are. I think Rule of Rose and Kuon are pretty much the two most expensive survival horror games out there that can kind of range like well above $500. I mean, Haunting Ground, I'm surprised I have, because that was my original copy that I bought for the PlayStation 2 that I just kept. I just hung on to it. So, like with anything, there's always emulation. You can always do that. I know not everybody can just afford these games, and nor should that be a prerequisite. This is why I'm such in favor of good game preservation, because I really want people to experience these games and to be able to play these games at any time, at any point. So, if you give people very little options to do that, they're going to find other ways. I hate to say it that way. So, so if you have any of these games in your collection, keep them and cherish them. Or you could sell them and make some money. Thanks for listening, guys.